Okay, we'll probably have a few more folks join us, but we're going to get started. Hello, my name is Lisa Gerloff, and I am the Executive Coordinator for the Rocky Mountains Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit. Thank you all for joining us today for our kickoff of the first Rocky Mountains CESU seminar series. Moving forward, this will be an annual spring series highlighting the region's best scientific talent and scholarship to help manage our public resources across social, cultural, economic, political, and environmental arenas. Our series theme this year is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, opportunities through the Rocky Mountains CESU. These are critical issues that cross all aspects of science, scholarship, and resource management. This series will explore how CESU partners are approaching these areas to foster positive change. A couple items before we move to today's seminar. I want to point out that our next seminar in this series will take place March 24th at 11 a.m. Mountain Time. Dr. Beth Horton from Yellowstone National Park and Jennifer Harrington from the University of Montana's Native American Natural Resource Program will discuss their partnership to provide internship opportunities for Native American college students to gain hands-on experience in natural and cultural resources in the Yellowstone Center for Resources. These students will gain the skills needed to enter resource management careers in the National Park Service and other federal agencies. It is one step in developing a workforce that reflects the diversity of the American population. So look for that announcement or check out our seminar page on the Rocky Mountain CESU website for more information. Today's panel presentation will run about 40 minutes, and we will have about 15-20 minutes for questions and discussion. As you have questions, please write them in the question and answer box, not the chat box, the question and answer box. And we will get through as many of your questions as we can. This seminar is being recorded, and we will make that recording available to you. Let me introduce to you Dr. Brendan Moynihan. Brendan works for the National Park Service as a senior scientist, a senior science advisor, and the research coordinator for the Rocky Mountains CESU. He holds a BA in political science from Bates College, an MS in restoration ecology, and a PhD in wildlife biology, both from here, the University of Montana. Much of his work has been on collaborative projects that brings private, NGO, state, federal, and academic partners together for research and conservation. In his present position, he chairs the Department of Interior's Bison Working Group and is the lead author of the 2020 Bison Conservation Initiative. Now I will turn it over to Brendan to introduce the seminar and the rest of our panel.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Really appreciate the introduction, and we're very thankful to be able to kick off this new seminar series with a presentation today that goes into depth talking about a very recent accomplishment. So not just an idea, but an accomplishment that is now realized and on the ground in South Dakota. So I'd like to introduce right off the bat my co-presenters today. After giving a general introduction on the topic today and situating the project for you in your minds, I'll ask Wizipan Little Elk to comment for some background and some vision on the Wolakota project, of which he is the principal driver for. Wizipan is in Rosebud, South Dakota today, and he is the CEO of the Rosebud Economic Development Corporation, which is the economic arm of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. After Wizipan speaks, we'll be joined by Dennis Jorgensen. Dennis joins us from Bozeman, Montana. He's a World Wildlife Fund manager for the Bison Program. And I'll come back with some recap and to talk a little bit about the federal approach to bison conservation and partnerships. And then we'll have plenty of opportunity, I think, for some question and discussion with the audience. So with that, I'll jump right in. And I think a good starting point is to go right into the geographic and spatial setting for the discussion today. The red dot in the inset of the United States is the location of the Rosebud Indian Reservation and the Wolakota Buffalo Range. The broader map that you'll see here, if you look to the left, it'll situate you at the very southern end of South Dakota, just north of the border with Nebraska, and a couple hours or so east of Wyoming. The Rosebud Indian Reservation is quite close to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. It's in proximity of some other major reservation landscapes, national grasslands, national parks, state lands, and Forest Service lands as well. So there's a really remarkable mix of working landscape and private lands, but also a backbone of conservation opportunity that's connected to reservations and state and federal lands as well. I want to go right ahead and share with you the moment of release of 100 buffalo that were donated from the Theodore Roosevelt National Park and Badlands National Park this fall. 50 each from those two national parks were sent to the Wolakota Buffalo Range. And we're going to jump in and just share the moment of the return of buffalo to this landscape after 150 years or so of absence. So it's hard to communicate how impactful that moment was, and for the few of us, the 24 of us that were able to be there, really constrained in size with that event due to COVID precautions, of course. But that comes from about 150 years in the making, relative to the big changes that occurred in the 1800s with both Buffalo and Native American peoples. So a bit of a conservation backdrop before we get back to the Wolakota project itself. Best estimates are that prior to 1800, there were approximately 30 to 50 million bison across North America, spanning Canada to Mexico and nearly coast to coast in the United States. This range map on the left-hand side shows that historic range of plains bison in dark brown, and wood bison in the more orange color going north. Both are subspecies of bison. The right-hand side will give you an idea. If you can make out some of those numbers, those are the years at which bison were last observed in that particular location. So if the backdrop is that beige or buff color, if you will, you can start to tease out how, if we observe bison in the southeast in 1760, and as we go more inward, the range is contracted. The years are later, and those represent the incremental contraction of bison locations in the wild in the United States. All in all, the reduction of bison ran from roughly 50 million down to fewer than 100 individuals in the wild. This is well documented in photos. Even after bison were gone, skulls and bones were picked up across the prairie and shipped to factories in the east to make bone china and all sorts of products, fertilizer, glues, many things. The extent of the reduction and the wholesale extermination, near extinction of bison, really is hard to fathom. And I want to take just a minute and try to help us understand what the scope of that reduction looked like. So if each one of these dots represents a single buffalo, this entire grid captures 1,000 animals. We zoom out and assemble several of those blocks. We can start to get a picture of what 10,000 buffalo would look like. We zoom out again, we can start to get a picture of what 1 million would look like. And at the low end of historic estimates, this is what 30 million buffalo would look like, with each one of those squares representing 10,000. By the time we hit 1890, the red dots in the center are the maximum number known to occur in the wild. 100 left out of about 30 to 50 million that had existed less than a century before. Now, it's worthwhile to point out that the reduction in bison was quite intentional, and it also coincides perfectly, of course, with the federal government policies to move, contain, assimilate, and restrict Native American peoples onto reservations. This backdrop gives you some perspective of how that change occurred over the course of the 1800s, and gives you a really clear idea of how that coincided with the policies to reduce both bison and Native American peoples in their geographic scope and numbers, frankly. It's interesting, though, that within say 20 years, 30 years or so of that completion of the near extermination of buffalo and the movement of most Native peoples in the contiguous 48 states on reservations, the U.S. government celebrated both buffalo and Native Americans on the currency, the famous Indian head or buffalo nickel. This one was one of the first in 1913, just a couple decades after the extermination policies were effectively complete, and just shows how there was a turnaround in the American psyche to use one of our most revered symbols and products, a currency, to highlight creatures and people that had been reduced so intentionally just a few decades before. Fast forward about 100 years from that date, and buffalo were designated just about 4 years as our national mammal, celebrating unity, resilience, and health as symbols of the American identity. And that brings us to where we are with the Wolakota project today. That's just the simplest of backdrops, but it gives you a sense of where we came from through very intentional policies to control both Native American people and buffalo, to bringing them back today. And what I'd like to do now is ask Wizipan Little Elk to take it from this point and talk to us a bit about the vision of the Wolakota project, what it means, where it came from, and where it looks to be in the next few years. So Wizi, if you would.
Thank you, Brendan. Iha chante was then up a choose up a law. Wizipha a match up in Sichangula Kota Hemachana Ashke Galuipi Tiosh by Emataha. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Wizipha. I greet each and every one of you with a good heart. I am from the Sichangul Lakota band of the Great Sioux Nation, also known as the Rosebud Sioux Tribe, and I come from the wrapped hair band of the Sichangul, and I'm very honored and happy and glad to participate in today's presentation and discussion. I was thinking about the title of today's presentation, around justice and equity, diversity and inclusion, and those are some heavy words. Those are some very kind of big and meaningful words, and but it's also timely. And I think that as we do our work here in Rosebud, one thing that we're constantly talking about is developing and implementing local solutions to global challenges. And at this point in history, I think that there are two existential challenges and crises that humanity as a collective is facing, and that is social inequity and climate change. And the kind of work that we're talking about today, particularly for the Wolakota project, is one of the best examples that I've ever been a part of in terms of my career and in my life to address those challenges. And so to talk a little bit about our mission and our vision, I think it's important to also understand kind of who we are as Lakota. And in our creation story, we used to call ourselves Pte or Pte Oyate. Sometimes that gets translated as Buffalo Nation. It is an accurate term, but really, what that refers to is a period in our history when we used to live underground. We say that that we existed upon the earth in a form. We don't quite know what that form was, and that we were given specific instructions from God, from our Creator, on how to live and act and behave on earth. And that many of the beings that used to live on earth during that time began to move and go away from those original instructions given by the Creator. They became ungrateful. They became unkind. They became wasteful, and they began to destroy each other and to destroy the environment around them. And if we think about today's times, it in many ways can kind of describe the situation that we're facing with climate change and social inequity. The consequence of that was that the earth cleansed herself. There was fire, there was water, there were fire from above, and that, but not all of us were, disobeyed those original instructions. And so for those beings that obeyed those original instructions, we went underground and we were protected. And the beings that did not obey those instructions were wiped out and killed. And we often refer to them as the children of disobedience, meaning they were the ones that did not listen. They disobeyed the original instructions. And we lived underground for a time. And then, there were some events when we emerged from the earth, and we say that happened in Wind Cave. So that would be Wind Cave National Park. And when we emerged, some of us came out as human in our current form, and some of us came out as buffalo. And that, the ones that emerged as buffalo basically took on that form and that shape in order to care and protect for, those of us who are in human form. And I talk about and begin with that story to say that there is no real difference between Lakota people and buffalo. We've always considered ourselves to be of the same people, to be of the same blood, and that our destinies, our future, our health are inextricably tied to one another. And that when buffalo are healthy, we as Lakota will be healthy. And when the Lakota are healthy, the buffalo will be healthy. And so our journey of resilience and emergence and coming back in a strong way is the same journey that the buffalo are taking and are going to have to take. And, as Brendan's presentation showed, basically the destruction of buffalo and the genocide committed against buffalo mirrored that of, kind of what happened to many indigenous people, including the Lakota. And so we've been on a journey for over 100 years to bring back buffalo in a way that's stronger, to give them a good home. And so our work is simply a continuation of many generations before us to do this. And so when the opportunity came for us to take a look at working with buffalo, we went back to our kind of mission statement and who we are and kind of what our organization does. And so I'm the CEO for REDCO, Rosebud Economic Development Corporation. My tribe, the Rosebud Sioux Tribe, we have a constitutional provision that says that we are to consider the implications of our decisions on the next 7 generations. And our organization has said, you know what, we take that very serious. It's not just simply an aspirational constitutional provision. Let's actualize that. And so what we have been doing and what we are doing is developing and implementing a 7-gen plan. It's a 175-year plan of prosperity for our people and for our region. And within this plan, we're asking some very simple questions. Where are we going to live? How many of this are there going to be? Will we have clean water? Where will our food come from? What kind of housing will we live in? What will our education, energy systems, healthcare systems look like? What will our relationship with technology be? And laying out, some just kind of big goals of where we want to be as a people and for our region. As a part of that overall plan and vision, it has to include buffalo. And so when it comes to food, when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to addressing climate change, when it comes to keeping our culture and our language and our spirituality alive, it becomes a paramount duty of ours to take care of our buffalo relatives the same way that they took care of us for thousands and thousands of years. We have a duty to take care of them now. And the reality is that they actually take care of us far more than we'll ever be able to take care of them. But we have to try and to continue to manage that reciprocal relationship. So how do you do that? How do you create and find those opportunities? So what REDCO is and what we do, we are an ecosystem of organizations. We are a subsidiary of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe, an economic subsidiary. And so we own and manage 17 different subsidiary businesses doing business on and off the reservation. We have a nonprofit that engages in community programming. And then we have a emerging CDFI, community development financial institution. And together we take a holistic, kind of multidimensional approach to our work in, improving people's overall quality of life. And so, we said, how in the world are we going to help with buffalo, kind of using the platform that we have? And, that's how and why we started Wolakota. We call the project Wolakota Regenerative Buffalo Range because at its heart, what the word Wolakota means is to live the Lakota way of life, which in order to be a good Lakota means that we have to be good relatives. That's one of our purposes in life, is to be good relative. So we went on a path and a journey to say, let's do something big, let's do something significant for our Buffalo Tatanka relatives. And so we worked with our tribe, with another entity within our tribe called Tribal Land Enterprise, which manages about 650,000 acres of the tribe's land, and pitched them an idea and said, hey, we have this chunk of land. It's 28,000 acres. It's typically been in the past, it's been a kind of standard typical cattle ranch. Let's make it a buffalo range. And through the help and assistance of others, including WWF, we've been able to secure a 15-year lease on this land. When fully stocked, it will be home to 1,500 buffalo, and it will be the largest Native American owned and managed buffalo herd in North America. I want to put that in context. Well, I think that that's pretty amazing, and it sounds cool to say that. By far, it will not be the largest buffalo herd. It might be the largest Native American one, but it won't be the largest buffalo herd. And there are a number of other ranches that are larger than what we have. And we're looking at this from an economic development and from a socio-economic perspective. We will be harvesting the animals, and we have a path forward to do that. And given our business kind of background, we're good at that. But we've also drawn some lines in the sand in terms of how we're going to raise our animals and take care of them. And one of those is, under no circumstances will our buffalo ever be treated as anything but buffalo. They will never be treated like cattle. When we harvest them, that'll be done with prayer and ceremony in the field. And we're really, doing this to be able to really provide them a home, but to do it in a way that's going to be economically sustainable. When I talk about Wolakota and this idea of being relatives, and when I talk about this idea of 7-gen and 7-generation thinking, what that means is a few things. First, we have to act in the best interests of our grandchildren's grandchildren. Second, we must make ethical and moral-based decisions when we decide what and what not to do. And then third, we must embrace complex systems thinking. And this idea of interrelatedness and this idea of Wolakota are really one and the same. And so to do what that means is to do anything meaningful, to do anything significant, we have to work together. We have to work in partnership, and we have to work in unison. And I think that this project, the Wolakota Buffalo Range, is the epitome of what is possible. And so you have a tribal corporation that owns and operates, subsidiaries. You have a partnership with the World Wildlife that represents an amazing NGO dedicated to wildlife and stewardship. We have this amazing partnership with the Department of Interior being written into the 10-year National Bison Management Plan. We have partnerships with businesses, which would include Wild Idea Buffalo and Ted Turner Ranch Enterprises, to help and assist us from a technical assistance perspective, utilizing kind of best business practices. We have other philanthropic and nonprofit entities that have donated money through grants, and then we have also engaged in raising money on a loan basis through social impact investing. And so you have this amazing group of kind of private sector, governmental, tribal, native governmental entities all working together to do something big, massive, and historic, and really something that hasn't been done before. And so when we talk about equity and inclusion and kind of justice, I think that this is what we're talking about. We're talking about a ground-up solution that comes from the people and really the people working on behalf of, we would call them animals, but really they're our relatives who've had genocide committed against them. And to give them, we're working and we're kind of their representatives, but what we're really doing is giving Buffalo and Tatanka an opportunity and a platform to be who they are and to share their story and an opportunity for them to do their work on the ground as a keystone species. And if those in privilege, and privilege is all about power, those who have the ability to make decisions, to raise money, and to distribute resources are listening and allowing those who've historically been disenfranchised to tell their story and to be who they are, then I believe wholeheartedly and in my heart that we can address these two massive crises facing humanity: socioeconomic inequity and climate change. Thanks.
It was an exceptional overview of where the project came from and what the meaning of it is. Dennis, can I ask you to join in and give us some perspective on how World Wildlife Fund fits into this and some of the broader thinking of where you might be able to replicate this elsewhere?
Absolutely. Thank you, Brendan. Next slide, please. And I'll just say good afternoon, everyone. And I'm in the unenviable position of following someone who stems from a people that have an oral tradition and speaks so beautifully and eloquently, but I'll do my best. So I just want to situate World Wildlife Fund's work in this context. So World Wildlife Fund's Northern Great Plains program has been in existence since about 2001. And here on the map, you will see our Northern Great Plains ecoregion, short and mixed grass prairie, but only on the US side. We do extend into Alberta and Saskatchewan in Canada, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'll just refer to our work in the United States. So within this landscape that you see here, the Northern Great Plains ecoregion represents about 183 million acres. And there are 15 native nations within that manage some of the largest tracts of intact grassland in the overall region. Tribes manage about 15.7 million acres of tribal land, which is about 8.6% of the ecoregion. And of that, about 70% is intact grassland. And I should probably just mention that in addition to our work on bison restoration, we also work on the restoration of black-footed ferrets and on the conservation of grasslands, primarily in partnership with ranchers who manage about 70% of the ecoregion on private lands. Next slide. All right, so I just want to speak to our bison program goals specifically. And of course, most relevant to this presentation is the fact that WWF supports tribal partners to address their needs in establishing sustainable bison programs, ecologically, culturally, and economically sustainable. And of course, that is in the context of what our tribal partners identify as their priorities as well. But we want to try and work to ensure that there will be durable solutions to establishing bison herds in that context. Another overarching goal is our goal to establish 5 herds of at least 1,000 bison each in the Northern Great Plains by 2025 with national parks and with native nations within the region. In the map on the left, you will see the sites where WWF is currently working to restore bison. And as I mentioned, these sites either represent partnerships with native nations, they represent partnerships with national parks, and they also represent some private and leased lands partnerships, as for example with American Prairie Reserve. All right, so in addition, you'll just see here how we're moving towards our goal. Our in-conservation herds with our partners, we've reached approximately 3,000 bison in those herds. And Wolakota represents another site where we're working towards that goal. So next slide, please. All right, just very briefly, I want to talk a little bit about WWF's approach to partnership with Native nations within our bison program. So I guess I would start by saying that a key thing for you all to understand is that World Wildlife Fund is striving to understand the values, needs, and aspirations of our tribal partners on a given reservation and with a given Native nation. On the left-hand side, you'll see a reference to a survey. And just briefly, I'd like to share a story. So at Fort Peck Reservation, where we also work on restoring bison, we were approached by a community working group, a group of community stakeholders that were working with Montana State University on public and sexual health in their community. And it was a group of made up of elders, teachers, and more broadly community members. And they asked Montana State University if they could help them answer the question, how can we ensure that the return of buffalo will contribute to the health and prosperity of our people as our prophecies said they would with the return of buffalo? The group felt that, the bison had been back on Fort Peck Reservation since about the year 2000, but they weren't seeing all of the impacts that they had hoped and expected. And so when they asked Montana State University this question, Montana State University, the team they were working with said, well, we're not experts on bison, but maybe we can engage some folks who are. And so Montana State University and the group from Fort Peck approached us and asked if we would be interested in being involved. And we were excited to be involved. And because it was a community-led effort and an effort led by the people, we had a really great starting point of conducting a survey where we were asking community members about their values, their needs, and their aspirations for the return of buffalo and the future. And it wasn't, I have to say, it wasn't a typical conservation sort of survey. We were asking about how often people consume buffalo, how often they would like to consume buffalo, their feelings about buffalo being relatives, and their thoughts about those things. And it was very broad and essentially geared towards answering the questions that the community wanted answered. And the survey and the results that came from that really gave some clear direction for that buffalo program and how we could work together to bring resources, add capacity, address identified needs in the community. And I would like to stress that, that I don't feel that it's World Wildlife Fund's place to direct the activities of our partners. We want to understand what the needs are, and to the extent that we can bring resources to those needs, we will. And in terms of what WWF has to offer, I guess I would say, I feel like we can offer expertise in terms of things like GIS skills within our team, an established global platform. Everyone knows the WWF brand. And when we communicate, often that reaches a national and international audience, giving the opportunity for our tribal partners to reach those same audiences and to potentially draw their interest and their support. We have networks of partners, whether that be the Turner Foundation, Turner Ranches, the National Park Service, Department of Interior, and a network of philanthropists. And for the discussion of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, I think it's really important to recognize that, it's part of my hope is that we have some discussions that are more difficult. When it comes to philanthropy, everyone's trying to get their piece of the pie, but my hope is that in our work with tribes, we will also help them build networks of contacts in the philanthropic world that they didn't have previously, and that maybe we can impart some knowledge and share some things that help them to work in that field. And overall, in our experience working the Northern Great Plains program, I think that we bring some perspective on things that we have tried that have worked in this tribal context. So, I guess I would just say that I feel privileged to work with Wizipan and to support his vision at Redco and for the Wolakota Buffalo Range. And I also feel privileged to work with Brendan Moynihan, who was integral in helping to see those 100 bison arrive at the Wolakota Buffalo Range. And on behalf of World Wildlife Fund, I would just say that, I see such great opportunity in the next 10 years for replicating projects like this, working with a number of Native nations to bring back the buffalo, to bring prosperity, to bring health. And I truly believe that as people hear these stories and learn of projects just like this, that it's undeniable that resources should be brought to them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis, very much. And actually, even though we didn't rehearse this entirely beforehand, I'm thankful for that perspective, because I think this idea of providing a framework or scaffolding upon which partners can grow and support each other is really important. It's something I'm going to talk about now with a bit of an overview of how the Department of Interior and its underlying agencies came to be involved in this Wolakota project, and how it fits really within our mission and mandate as given to us by Congress. So the Bison Conservation Initiative is a product of the Department of Interior Bison Working Group, and that group's been in place for about 12 years now. It comprises members of the 5 bureaus that all have a hand in direct management of or support of bison management or conservation. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which of course manages the National Wildlife Refuge System, the Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the USGS, which is often described as the science arm within the Department of Interior. The initiative was unveiled by the Secretary of Interior in May of 2020. And I won't go into tremendous amount of detail, but I do want to highlight some overarching goals and a couple key actions that will help give some context for how this discussion in this project to support justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion fit within some of the mission and mandate of the Department of Interior under that umbrella of the Bison Conservation Initiative. So the 5 overarching goals of the Bison Conservation Initiative, or BCI, I might stumble into using acronyms here, are to support and sustain and establish wild, healthy bison herds within the United States. We will do our best work internally for the herds that we ourselves manage within national parks, national refuges, wildlife refuges, and in partnership with states on BLM lands, in some cases in Utah. Part of doing our best work internally is to do the hard, difficult, and very detailed technical science work of managing bison conservation genetics, intending to that issue that flows from 30 to 50 million bison being reduced down through a bottleneck of fewer than 100. The new initiative really promotes continuation of that technical scientific work with an emphasis on genetics, but gives us the ground to leap forward and add some of these some of this engagement much more broadly. And by that I mean we now have 3 specific articulated goals within the Bison Conservation Initiative to pursue shared stewardship in partnership with states, tribes, NGOs, and other partners, to actively pursue the ecological restoration of bison to landscapes, given their role as keystone species and exceptionally influential components of landscapes and ecosystems. And also to move forward to recognize this inextricable connection between bison and humans, not just Native Americans, but certainly with a pronounced emphasis on that importance in that shared origin story that many Great Plains tribes have, but also for the broader American public as the national mammal. Some specific actions that we're working on now under that umbrella of the Bison Conservation Initiative. We've kicked off a team to develop a meta-population strategy, which is essentially looking at how do we most effectively manage the federal herds in a connected way to meet conservation genetics objectives. That's kind of the whole cold, hard science perspective or underpinning that enables us to make sure that we for the herds that the federal government manages, that we are doing our best work to sustain this species over the long term and to enable this species to persist and allow for us to build these other goals on top of. We're just about to kick off a shared stewardship plan that'll be informed to some degree by discussions that are going to be hosted by the American Bison Society at the annual meeting in the fall. But we're gonna think through this development of a shared stewardship plan about not just how we can be best partners as Department of Interior agencies, but also how can we move beyond our looking internally within, say, Park Service or refuge boundaries and acreage, and realize that we're part of a larger community, part of a larger landscape that has interest and actions occurring on its own. How can we engage with partners to support their best work as well? And then one specific action under the BCI is to institutionalize low stress handling practices within the department. And this means that we are working to continually move past a history of bison management that was built to some degree on livestock handling practices as we established Department of Interior herds in the early 1900s, and to internalize for ourselves the recognition that bison are native North American wildlife. And that's one of these key new directions that is promoted by the Bison Conservation Initiative. This point of recognizing and managing bison as Native American wildlife is important. It's more than just semantics. It sets the framework by which we look to intervention, how we manage landscapes, how we pursue establishment of truly wild free roaming herds, how we think about natural selection on herds and selective pressures, including predation and predator communities like wolves and grizzly bears. It really drives a lot of thinking, and it gives us a position, a very clear position within which we sit when we have conversations with other partners, including states, tribes, and NGOs. It also gives us this direction to link ecological and cultural restoration, recognizing that inherent connection between people and the animal and the broader ecology and landscape. So the overall Department of Interior approach to partnership and opportunities, now that Wizipan and Dennis have both talked about this, is to work under the framework of the Department of Interior Bison Working Group. That working group that I presently chair has the direction now of the Bison Conservation Initiative, unveiled in May of 2020. And one of the key goals that we're working on and working toward is shared stewardship. And I won't dwell more on this, but it provides the backbone by which we have the grounds and the authority and the direction to move forward with partnership to realize shared goals. It recognizes that partnership with states, tribes, NGOs, other stakeholders, private producers where possible, private landowners, those partnerships are essential to work at that scale, and given the complexity, that's the backdrop of the ecological and cultural significance of bison on this continent. More specifically, as one agency under the Department of the Interior, the National Park Service has really been working hard in recent years to actively do a better job at linking natural and cultural resources. And though it may seem strange to some listeners, in many federal agencies, natural resource management is siloed, if you will, from cultural resource management. The agency structure has been set up in such a way where those two worlds were seen as different disciplines, and in many cases are treated very differently based on law, policy, regulation, or the actual resource conservation practices that are required. But for a species like bison, given the backdrop that you've heard a lot about today, you can't look at those two things separately. And in fact, if you try to force that historic perspective or organizational structure onto an issue like bison conservation that has such deep roots and connections to human identity, an iconic status for the American public, its role in landscape and shaping human health and ecological function, we'll probably run into trouble pretty quickly if we try to keep those silos contained. So we're interested in looking to bison conservation as a way to help us develop those linkages across natural and cultural resources. And really, I think federal lands in general, for bison certainly, and for other natural and cultural resource issues, we manage remarkable world-class natural and cultural resources within our own boundaries. But I think, as we all know, it feels like the world's changing pretty rapidly, and I think that there's great opportunity for national parks, national wildlife refuges, federal lands in general, to really become a scaffolding, the structure upon which others' good work and sovereignty and self-determination and initiative can be built and can be attached. Just a couple wrap-up thoughts here before we move to some time for discussion. There are many points where this work for bison conservation moves well beyond kind of the cold, impersonal process of federal management of natural and cultural and trust resources. As Wizipan mentioned, it touches on these weighty ideals and these goals of reconciliation, really. Of course, all of it occurs within the framework of law and regulation and policy and formal consultation between sovereign nations. Those are the structures that enable us to do better work and also prohibit us from repeating some of the brutal history of the past. And we need to acknowledge that history and be honest about it. But even as we face and acknowledge it, I think that we have a remarkable moment right now to repair some past wrongs that still reverberate with present day impacts and harm to communities and people and landscapes. But we shouldn't be motivated just by shame or guilt or fear or conflict. I think what we can do is be motivated by the very themes of this seminar series. So justice, pursuing equity, diversity, and inclusion. Bison conservation really isn't just about the animal. It's about the people who are connected to it. It's about rich cultural tradition. It's about the place of wildness and strength and resilience in the American identity. And it's about all these things that when we pursue them through partnership can lead us incrementally down this path toward reconciliation and improvement. So I know these are weighty ideals, weighty tasks, weighty issues, but I think all of us are confident that the bison and all it represents is big enough and strong enough to carry that weight if we allow it to. So with that, I'll ask Lisa to take over moderation to see if we have any questions or discussion. And I'll welcome Dennis and Wizipan to unmute and turn your videos back on if you would.
Yes, thank you, Brendan, Wizi, and Dennis. We do have some questions. Again, I will say if you have questions, please type them in the question and answer box and we will try to get to them. We will have our official wrap up just right before 4 o'clock to be respectful of people's time and other commitments that they may have. But our panel has said that they are available to stick around for another 15 minutes or so. So after our official wrap up, if you want to stay on, we'll continue with some questions. So let's start off. Wizi, here's a question for you. Could you say a bit more about how you see the role of bison in climate change mitigation and climate protection?
Absolutely. Kind of getting to the, one of the other questions. So bison are a keystone species in the Great Plains, meaning that, you know, when you reintroduce buffalo and they're managed in a kind of more natural and wild way, after about 3 years, what people have seen is that the overall biodiversity of the area begins to grow and increase. And we're talking in biodiversity both in kind of animals and birds, but also in plants as well. And, you know, when we look at, you know, kind of climate change, you know, we have to, two of the big strategies are, one, rewilding our natural spaces, and two, doing a better job of managing in a regenerative way our agricultural lands, which also includes range land management. And so, you know, kind of from that perspective, when we put buffalo back on the land, you're going to see more animals, more birds, but ecologically, from a plant perspective, you're going to see the reintroduction of the kind of Great Plains bioecosystem. And if we remember back in the days, you know, grass used to be 6 feet tall in some areas. You could build houses out of the sod. And so you're getting all that carbon stored back into the root systems. When buffalo come back, those strong prairie ecosystems are going to come back, and they have other activities that they do and so they're working for the planet. You know, they're working for the ecosystem, they're working for the planet, and any global kind of action or plan to mitigate climate change has to include prairie, rangeland, grasslands, and it has to include buffalo.
What does wild mean in this context? Free roaming? As a migratory species, how does this behavior factor into long-term management objectives?
Somebody else want to take that, or you want me to?
Sure, I'll take a crack at that. You know, it's only been the last 100 years or so, maybe really the last 50 or 60 years, that we've had to pause and think about what wild means. It used to be just an inherent characteristic of unsettled, unbuilt, untrammeled, if you will, places. Nonetheless, we do need to define what wild means, and there are different ways to do that. From the perspective of working on the DOI Bison Working Group, it means having herds that are large enough to sustain genetic viability and diversity over time. It means that you have a representation of the breadth of natural selection pressures that and that animal's place in a natural community. Things like competition for breeding and things like pressure from predators are really very, very important for driving and sustaining genetic conservation over the long term and preserving evolutionary potential over the much longer time frame. Virtually all bison herds now are spatially constrained in some way, meaning that many are relatively small and fenced entirely. Even what we cite as our true wild free roaming herd in the lower 48, Yellowstone, is constrained spatially. It's not, bison coming out of the park in the wintertime are tolerated to a degree and by agreement and design and negotiation by humans. And so wildness is what we enable them to be, but it means minimizing our intervention, minimizing handling at the same time as we do work to rescue a species that has been through an incredibly tight bottleneck. Dennis, you may have some to add to that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Brendan. I agree. And the one thing that I would add, and I think this is really important to recognize, is that bison are not going to be all things in all places. You know, we have bison across North America. In some places, they can be entirely free roaming when you get up into northern Canada and Alaska. Of course, you're still going to run into jurisdictional boundaries up there, but they may not be fenced. But I think, you know, in some ways, I think it's important to embrace the fact that bison have kind of this mixed status and haven't strictly been restored as wildlife. And although, you know, I think we could all aspire to that, I think there's going to be certain places where we can restore them as wildlife, and there's some exciting projects that are on the horizon that are possible where bison can be semi-free roaming to free roaming. And then there's many contexts where, you know, I think it's important to recognize, even when you're talking about 28,000 acres and recognizing that there's a fence, in the picture behind Wizipan, the furthest hills there are still within the property. And so 28,000 acres, bison can still be bison in a certain sense. There may be certain natural selection processes like predation that are not necessarily happening in a certain system, but that's the contemporary context.
I want to acknowledge that this is the official ending of our seminar. So thank you for joining us today and kicking off our first Rocky Mountain CESU seminar. And thank you to our panel members, Brendan, Wizipan, and Dennis. We appreciate that you joined us today. And hidden behind the W.A. Franke College box is Bethany Allen, who was a big part of organizing and the technical aspects of this seminar. So thank you, Bethany. If you need to leave, sorry to see you go, but if you would like to stick around, we will continue answering some questions. So here's one more question. Grasslands are underrepresented in the Park Service portfolio. Most grassland conservation lands are under the purview of the BLM. What is their role in bison restoration, and has it changed with the DOI initiative?
Yeah, it's a great question, and for me, it gets directly to the how incredibly fortunate we are in this country to have as diverse a system of public lands as we do. So the national parks, to oversimplify things, the national parks are often, especially the large kind of marquee parks that we think of, are high elevation mountainous areas. Of course, they include grasslands and meadows and benchlands and that sort of thing. The national park system is actually quite a bit much more diverse than that when we think about Midwestern parks, Wind Cave, Badlands, Theodore Roosevelt, among others. But within DOI, BLM is a full-fledged partner. Bureau of Land Management is a full-fledged partner in the Bison Conservation Initiative. They do manage a tremendous amount of grasslands. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's on the order of 93 million acres in the BLM portfolio nationally. The National Wildlife Refuge System, typically, at least in the continental contiguous 48, has relatively smaller holdings, but many of them, especially the larger holdings, are grassland areas. The U.S. Forest Service, under the Department of Agriculture, actually manages national grasslands in the Midwest region, and we're having active conversations right now to make sure that as we move the Bison Conservation Initiative forward, we're in close consultation and coordination with the U.S. Forest Service and their national grassland system, along with national forests, which include quite a bit of grassland, actually. So it's the restoration is a key goal. You know, we list ecological restoration and cultural restoration as independent goals, so we can pursue them independently. But we have some overarching language that really addresses the importance of linking them into what we call an ecocultural framework to include the human component as well.
Christina H. says, thank you for a great presentation. Are there plans in place to manage the herd for numbers and genetic diversity? And would that be part of the metapopulation strategy?
Yeah, exactly. So that's the backbone of the DOI metapopulation strategy. It's unfortunate that it's a technical term that doesn't have a whole lot of I guess inherent communication value to it. But essentially, what a metapopulation is it's a population or a collection of populations. And the whole scope of the metapopulation strategy is to recognize explicitly that the federal herds are not going to be well managed over the long term by managing them in isolation of each other. And the metapopulation strategy is specifically looking at both using and generating new best available science to inform a process by which we would have occasional movement of bison from one herd to another. In fact, as part of the Bison Conservation Initiative launch this year, the other transfer that we had within the DOI Bison Conservation Initiative, in addition to Wolakota, was a movement of 5 yearling females from Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge outside Denver to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, specifically for genetic augmentation and to capitalize on an opportunity to fold those animals into a genetic study. So yes, that question is spot on and exactly what our next task is.
And if I could just add, I'm sure that Weezy would love to speak to this, but I think he's really excited about the fact that, as a recipient of National Park Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service bison, as well as American Prairie Reserve bison, it could be an extremely diverse herd receiving bison from all those sources and additional future sources.
So here's a question. They're curious to know how much consultation was done with tribes before the implementation of the metapopulation study. My impression for most tribal managers is that most are against genetic test and tracking. How does that move forward in listening to tribes about how these relatives should be managed?
Yeah, so that question gets right to the heart and the difficult space of this link between conservation biology and the ecocultural meaning and depth of what bison are. So in the simplest sense, there's some metapopulation or some genetic testing that occurred to understand what our capability is to preserve the species over the long term, and that question is based on two concerns. One is maintaining maximum genetic diversity of bison as a conservation interest. And the other is trying to sort out and identify and understand a legacy problem, which is relatively minor, but it is of concern, which is the introduction of some cattle genes into bison that was associated with intentional interbreeding efforts in the very early 1900s when there were so few bison left. So that's where that genetic work comes from. It's the backbone of making sure that in managing the public federal bison herds over the long term, that we do our best work. And the question of tribes and their view of genetic testing is incredibly complex. Some tribes are of the mind that if it looks and behaves like a bison, that's good enough. We don't need to go any farther to understand the genetics. Some are concerned quite a bit about the presence of cattle genes in bison and are interested in restoring quote unquote pure bison. Some don't even want to have the conversation and think that the federal government even having the conversation is akin to requiring demonstration of blood quantum for identification or association or membership in a federally recognized tribe. which is part of that incredibly complex and brutal history that we talked about earlier. So that's probably as far as I could take it, I guess, in the time that we have. But it's an important point to recognize, and the process of consultation really comes in when we make decisions about allocation of bison and about allocation of resources to restoration activities. And at that point, formal consultation with sovereign nations is absolutely part of what will occur, and it's a legal requirement. So it's a really rich question, Lisa.
The BLM in Montana is currently making efforts to manage bison as if they were cattle, forced rotation and cross-fencing of pastures. How is that reconciled with DOI's position that managing bison as wildlife in an ecologically beneficial way is a primary goal of the initiative?
Yeah, I'd say that I'd love to have one of our BLM partners to the Bison Working Group on this call, and I wanted to make sure that we take some questions too that get us to the theme of the partnership in justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. But I will say that from I don't want to usurp the discussion with a sole focus on federal agencies and federal activities. But I will say briefly that we're not done yet. We part of where we are in this moment is that we've accomplished some great things. The federal government has actually done a very good job of conserving and saving the species and from that bottleneck that occurred, that the federal government itself drove. We also have some really big obstacles in front of us. One is that there are visionary and aspirational aspects to the Bison Conservation Initiative that are going to take a lot of work and some change, frankly. To have large free roaming herds in the United States is super difficult. The BLM is an incredibly large and diverse organization with some quite rigid legal and regulatory sideboards that make each individual situation worth discussing in its own merit. But I will say that the BLM has some great success stories on its own. And in fact, probably the two of the great examples of truly wild free roaming bison in the United States are state managed herds in Utah on BLM lands. Those two herds, the Henry Mountains herd and the Book Cliffs herd, are under BLM jurisdiction in that they reside primarily on BLM lands, and one of those herds ranges onto the Ute reservation. But they're managed primarily by the state of Utah. So those are herds that are publicly hunted. They're available for a level of access that to the American public that other herds are not, and it's complicated.
And Lisa, I'll just indicate I need to drop off as well at this point, but I really appreciate you all facilitating this discussion. And you know, I don't know if there's a way to provide folks with contact information, but I'm happy to answer questions via email if that's a possibility.
Well, I'll just remind folks that this is being recorded, and we will send out a follow-up email with that recording next week, and we'll also include contact information for all of you. I actually think this is probably a great time to wrap up. It looks like Wizipan dropped off already. So again, thank you, Dennis and Brendan, and all of the folks that stayed on with us. An important topic and a great way to kick off our first seminar series. So thank you.
Thanks so much.
Great, thank you.